Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today is Tuesday, September 14th, 2021, and I have the pleasure of speaking with London Paul from the Sirius Report. I've heard of London Paul many years ago, the first time. I think Jim Willie used to mention him a lot. And in the last probably 18 months or so, I've started following him on Twitter. And we do have discussions on Twitter. But I would say that basically we agree on almost everything that's going on in the world. So today, London Paul decided to come and talk with me and our viewers here at Monaco 64. Welcome, Paul. And it's really nice to have you on.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mario. Yeah, likewise. It's a real thrill for us to be able to, I think, have an initial kind of chat. As we said before we came on air, I think it makes more sense to have a sort of more 30,000 foot view of developments, and then, in the future we can drill down to more specific things that are going on. Because for me, there's been unprecedented changes going on for 20 years, and probably even a bit longer than that, but we can extrapolate it back historically, probably pre-World War II, but we're not going to go into that level of detail, certainly not today. But yeah, just to provide a bit of background as to, I was originally actually an academic. I was a physicist, and then I kind of moved out of academia because I didn't want to have a long-term career in academia, and I was more interested in business, by that point, finance and economics. So I kind of made the move out of academia and science into the financial services sector, which seems like a massive kind of U-turn from what I was doing. But actually, a financial institution at the time literally said to me, well, we'll take a gamble on you because you've got an interesting background. And then I had a career, obviously, working in the financial services sector, worked in numerous banks, a lot of time in contract positions. And I was obviously in London, but not entirely in London. And then kind of decided post-2008, the whole Lehman and global financial crisis, that it was time to move on and do some other things. And I worked with other people on various projects, including working in the commodity sector, in gold and silver, in terms of mining opportunities or those kind of projects, rather than not being a gold and silver bullion dealer, but at the sort of coalface end, and various other projects. And then we kind of decided, due to a lot of sort of family reasons, to start doing the Sirius Report as well. And that kind of has morphed in the last 5 years into something I wasn't really sure 5 years ago where it would go, but it's been successful from our perspective, and the intention really has always been to try and explain to people what is actually going on as what I've called this paradigm shift happening globally, which has actually been in the making for over 20 years. And I think that's a good starting point for our discussion. But that gives you a little bit of background as to my sort of what I've been involved in, obviously throughout my entire life, essentially from leaving academia anyway.
Yes, and it's interesting because I've looked into your website, into your Sirius Report, and all the geopolitical, financial, economic, social research that you do, the macro view, and I find it great value for $52.25 a year to have access to what you're thinking. And you told me before we started this interview that you're trying to reach the general public, the masses, try to let them know what's really going on. And that's kind of the same philosophy I had back in late 2015 when I started making my YouTube videos, that I wanted to bring out my expertise working in the City of London and in economics to the general public. And actually, I have people from all backgrounds. I have people in the city of London, people from Wall Street listening to me. So I don't mind. But I also have someone from, I don't know, in the Midwest, or someone in Singapore or Australia listening to me, which is great. And I think that's great that you've done that. And I highly recommend the viewers go to London Paul's website and see if there's something there for them. And if not, you can always follow the Sirius Report on Twitter. London Paul is very active there, and you can learn about what he's thinking.
No, thank you. That's very kind of you to say that, and much appreciated. So what I thought might be worth doing, because I have tweeted about this, and it creates a lot of intrigue and also concern from people, is essentially there was a group of individuals who subsequently I got to know on a personal level, and I call them effectively the architects of the actual global reset, not the idea the World Economic Forum is going to reset the world. And I mean, and in quite simple terms, Davos is, as knowing people who've actually been attendees at Davos who said to me, it's just a talking shop and it never resolves or makes any policy decisions. So from my perspective, that's a bit of a red herring, because people have heard the word reset, and they've heard the connotation of the Great Reset, and they put two and two together and believe that that's the future. And as I always say to people, well, look at the last Davos virtual online meeting they had, and just refer to the comments Putin and Xi made that basically was saying the unipolar world never existed. It's now failed, it's over, and the world's moving on to from their perspective, a multipolar world. So with regards to these people who are the architects, they're the architects because they didn't have any boundaries, didn't have nationalities, they're people from all over the world. And they effectively went to the Chinese and the Russians and said, look, we can see, or it's our belief in the future, that the Western financial system, the unipolar world as it exists in whatever form that is, has no long-term future. It's coming to an end. And I think there's a lot of people, and this was kind of the latter end of the 90s. So kind of around the time when the Chinese were admitted to the World Trade Organization. So China's were looking at the world from a different perspective at that point in time. Anyway, they went and talked to them and said, look, we're here to give you our thoughts as to where we see the future of the world going, what we would suggest in very broad terms, things you might like to want to take on board, and the decision's yours. They weren't dictating, they weren't part of some Western group trying to subvert Chinese and Russian perspective. They have no affiliation to any politic, any groups. They're just people who I regard as being visionaries. I've subsequently had conversations with them kind of just post 2009. And much of what they said 10, 11 years ago, there's hundreds of things. They said all these things will happen in the future. And in a very broad sense, they have happened. Okay, it's, as they always say, it's not time-driven, it's event-driven. So they said to the Chinese and the Russians, look, you need an alternative financial system. You have to go back to sound money, as opposed to the fiat monetary system. You need to, from the Chinese perspective, you need to look at resurrecting the Belt Road or the old Silk Road. With the Russians, they said, okay, you need to start to look at your own internal markets, how you might want to change how you operate your financial system, how you interact, with the rest of the world, how you build relationships. Because obviously Russia's a key part of Eurasia. We only have to look at it geographically. It kind of sits between what you would call Western Europe or the Eurozone and obviously Asia, including China and Southeast Asia, etc. So there was a logical conclusion. Now, the Chinese and the Russians were very receptive to the ideas. They went away and thought about it and went, yeah, there is going to come a point in time when US hegemony, the Western Empire, or unipolar world, whatever you want to call it, was on a downhill trajectory. And maybe another time we can discuss from my perspective. Ironically, the US was on a downhill trajectory prior to World War II, which kind of makes it all the more bizarre what happened at Bretton Woods. But that's a whole separate subject for discussion. So effectively at that point, they started to think about things. And obviously at that point, around that time, of course, it was the end of Yeltsin, and Putin obviously became the president, and the rest kind of history in regards to his role within Russia in a broader context. Of course, there was a time to sort of reflect on from China's perspective. I mean, what I will say about China and the World Trade Organization and the West moving its manufacturing base to China, the Chinese sat there and went, we can't believe that they're doing this, but thank you very much for doing it. Because in essence, it gave China an enormous foothold in Western markets that they thought they would have to develop from scratch. And of course, we understand why it was a very, very flawed decision that the West made. But part of the reason they did it, because even at that point, the West is not about one world governance or one world control. It was about how can we influence China and bring it into the fold? How can we influence Russia and bring it into the Western fold? Of course, it failed, and the Chinese and the Russians had no intention of ever doing that, and never more so than that. So they kind of reflect upon it, started to formulate some long-term plans. But of course, Russia was still going through this enormous phase of internal change in the sort of post-Soviet Union era. We all know what happened in Russia in the 90s, and effectively from a domestic perspective, with the oligarchic situation you had in Russia, there was an imperative to try and get that under control before you could start to really think, okay, how do we change our perspective internationally and globally? But of course, there was key events that happened through the sort of the early 2000s, but one of the big fundamental shifts in attitude and really changed the horizon and perspective for the Chinese and the Russians was, of course, 2008. Because then it was a realization, okay, we were told a decade before this collapse was coming. Now the collapse has happened. Okay, we can talk about another time about how the West fudged things for the last, 12, 13 years to pretend the collapse never happened, even though it did. So that was an enormous wake-up call. And notice in the immediate aftermath of 2008, suddenly we had the formation of BRICS. And all those developments we can talk about at another time. There was the AIIB, and then subsequently over the next decade, all these big changes in terms of developing the multipolar world, growing and expanding what became the One Belt, One Road, then the Belt and Road Initiative. This was all a direct consequence of events in 2008, because suddenly, from the Chinese perspective in that regard, they had an enormous wake-up call that said, hang on, this problem's now happened. And to many observers, it happened rather quickly, even though I think people, as we discussed before we came on, Mario, that for us it wasn't. It was very obvious a few years before. The other thing, of course, that happened in 2008, which changed China's attitude, was prior to that, they were always there to say, the US went, well, will you buy a bunch of treasuries? And there was this trust relationship. Yeah, we'll take the treasuries and here's a bunch of free dollars. When the United States suddenly said, no, actually, we're just going to print dollars, Chinese went, you've broken trust. And anyone who understands the Chinese mentality, trust is everything in a relationship. Once you break that trust, they then start to have fundamental problems. And that sort of was the chain reaction for everything we've seen principally in the last decade. So that started to sort of accelerate plans in China's perspective and Russia's as to, okay, we've had these discussions a decade before. We need to start thinking about a post-dollar world. What does that mean to us? I mean, you can't just leave the dollar overnight. You have to start to say, okay, what do we need to do in terms of our internal markets? What does that mean in terms of our external relationships? And how do we start to encourage a move away from a dollar-centric world to a multipolar world with bilateral currencies, etc.? So it started to formulate some thought processes. Of course, the West along the way made a catalogue of very crass and very poor judgment in terms of foreign policy, which changed attitudes. I mean, people often point to the Arab Spring, which was a bit of a mindset change for the Russians, but Ukraine was probably the pivotal moment where, what do we see in the immediate aftermath of the Maidan? China and Russia signed what was called the Holy Grail energy deal. It's no coincidence it happened. That was the moment where both of them went, okay, why did the United States do this? Okay, we understand they didn't like Yanukovych, they wanted him replaced, and they wanted a Western puppet, but they wanted to push NATO to the borders of Russia via Ukraine. But also, it was a moment where the United States were demonstrating their weakness because they wanted to drag Russia into a war and a conflict with Ukraine, which was never going to happen. And they also wanted to try and economically destroy Russia, which actually, of course, it failed and had the complete opposite effect. And of course, all that did was accelerate the dollarization. It accelerated in the minds of the Chinese and the Russians. The United States is a weak, failing empire, and we need to start to not assert ourselves, but we need to start saying, okay, the world has to prepare for a new reality, which I call the multipolar world, as opposed to the old reality, which is the unipolar world. And that really, in some senses, is kind of a very high overview of a sort of bunch of processes. And there's a lot of detail in between, obviously, we haven't discussed. But to give an idea, because often when I say to people, these architects, they go, are they related to Davos? Is it the World Economic Forum? Who are these entities? Why are they dictating policy? And as I said, they never dictated anything. They just went with a bunch of ideas. And the Chinese and the Russians embraced it. Ironically, no one in the West was interested. They were like, no, we're happy with the way the world is. It's all fine. There isn't a problem. Even though, of course, even back in the 90s and the early 2000s, the dot-com era was a clear indication that the West was in serious trouble because it tried to think in its own infinite stupidity that somehow the dot-com era would solve all our economic problems. Of course, it resolved nothing. It just hemorrhaged enormous amounts of capital that all effectively just disappeared into a black hole, and there was no real tangible return. Okay, we can argue what subsequently followed, but at that point, it resolved nothing. And maybe it's a good point to mention 9/11 very briefly. I'm not going to get into the detail, but the principal driver for as a consequence of 9/11 to go into Afghanistan was precisely because they wanted to corner the narco market. Because look at the US economic metrics going into Afghanistan and the whole 9/11 time. The United States was in serious economic problems. Suddenly, they weren't in the same serious economic problems post going into Afghanistan. And if people think that's a coincidence, fine, but for me, it's a very clear indication. That was the principal driver. But again, there's another example of the United States going to ridiculously extraordinary measures to try and circumvent the fact that they had serious structural problems, not least in the financial system, but the economy, because very rapidly, the sort of era of China joining the World Trade Organization and moving your manufacturing base out to the US, already there was problems. But in one sense, it's probably worth mentioning and going back to the fundamental problems that existed in Western economies, and the UK is a good example of this as well, was during the Thatcher-Reagan era, when they decided to have the financialization of economies. It was an absolutely crass error of judgment on every single level, because ultimately it contributed to the gutting of real wealth creation as opposed to fake wealth creation via the financial system. It also created all the environment to allow all this reckless speculation, which we saw signs of it pre-2008, but 2008 was a real clear indicator of what crass speculation does and how easily you can blow up a financial system on that basis. So we want to go back a little bit further. That was one of the pinch points where the West made horrendously bad mistakes. And this is why I always come back to this point. Maybe it's worth mentioning this. there isn't some big contrived plan going on in the world with people pushing chess pieces around and making big decisions, because we can pick any point in history, particularly from a Western perspective, in the last 20, 30 years, where they made countless crass errors of judgment, really, really poor decisions that contributed to the downfall of the West. So we've now got to the point where the West is collapsing. And from many people's perspective, they can't believe that this has happened, because they believe there is this overarching power structure that controls the world, which it doesn't. So therefore they go, well, there must be some method in this madness. Well, there is no method. The West is going down. They don't have any answers. They keep digging holes repeatedly for themselves. I mean, 2008 was a huge wake-up call. What did they do? Did precisely the wrong things. QE zero interest rate policy, spectacular failure. I mean, I wrote to the then US governments and said, whatever you do, do not have long-term QE zero interest rate policies, because in the end, you will destroy everything. You will destroy the financial system. You will destroy economies. You'll blow everything up. Of course, they didn't answer or even respond, which didn't entirely surprise me. But it's that level of how myopic the West is with regards to policy-making decisions, whoever ultimately makes policy decisions, because yes, we know governments are illusionary in the West, but there isn't this overarching power structure that's making decisions. They didn't make the decision to blow everything up. Everything's blowing up because they made the wrong decision. And the fact they spent from 2008 onwards trying to save the very financial system that currently exists, the very unipolar world, proves they were desperate to hang on to what they've got. But ultimately, it's futile, it's failing. And this is the other reason why they're constantly trying to undermine China and Russia, because that's the alternative. That's the new reality. They don't want the world to embrace the new reality, because when the new reality achieves its objectives and it's growing rapidly, at some point the new reality consumes the old reality. And when the old reality is gone, it's over. You can't magically make an empire collapse and then 2 days later tell the world, we've got a new empire, you're going to embrace it. Because here's the point. The world's already proving, with China, Russia, Iran, Southeast Asia, large parts of Africa, parts of South America, even parts of Europe, the Middle East, are all going, no, we're embracing the multipolar world, we're embracing new reality. That doesn't have anything to do with the West, and it's not a Western-backed operation, which is, because there's people out there who go, they're just moving operations east. They're not moving operations east, because everything Russia, China, and the multipolar world espouses to is exactly what they don't want to see happen, for the obvious reasons that we've just discussed, and countless other things, obviously, we can discuss in the future.
Yeah. So who are these architects? Are they like think tanks or?
No, they're not even a think tank. Basically, they were people who were a loose group of individuals from many different backgrounds. Some of them had financial backgrounds, some of them had geopolitical backgrounds or political backgrounds, but they're not people that everyone would know. It's not like, I could reel off a list of names and you would instantly go, oh, I know who these people are. They're just people who had spent, they're not young people, obviously. We're talking about, now it's 20 plus years ago. So they're quite advanced in age themselves now, but they worked for a long time. They got into advisory positions in companies, and they built reputations. So they built, and then eventually, of course, they got to the point where they had the respect and the ears of not the West, ironically, but Eurasia or Russia, China, etc., who went, okay, what have you got to say? What are you actually suggesting we listen and take on board? And that's one thing I know, because I've spent time working in China and with the Chinese, not Beijing government, by the way, just to be absolutely clear. But I've worked with them long enough to know that they're very receptive to ideas. It doesn't mean they're going to embrace the idea, but they're very interested in learning about things. They're interested in thinking things from a different perspective. So if you give them some ideas and they like it, they'll embrace it and they'll run with it. But the one thing they did know is the West was failing. They understood that and they went, okay, well, there's going to be this enormous vacuum. Someone's going to have to fill it. And it doesn't mean it's the old unipolar world kind of hegemony is going to be replaced by a Chinese, Russian hegemony. They've got no interest in that because they know it's ultimately futile. And I think Jack Ma said it best when he said, imagine if the United States had spent trillions developing its own economy instead of spending trillions blowing up the world. That's the kind of Chinese mentality, is what a stupid, pointless exercise in utter futility and all the things that wars, all the disgusting aspects of war that we all understand don't need to qualify. So they have a very different mindset. I always say, never look at China through the eyes of the West, because if you do, you won't see how China thinks about things. That's not a defense of China or policy decisions they make. That's just how they do things. They think very differently. And ironically, the Chinese people also think things very differently. It may surprise people, but predominantly the vast majority of the Chinese people actually like what the government does. Now, people in the West might go, I can't believe this, or this seems unbelievable, but it's actually a reality. Because the truth is, if Chinese people really disliked in huge numbers what the Beijing government did, they'd be overthrown within the blink of an eye. Because you can't control 1.4 billion people. It's not possible. So that's not defending the Chinese political system or a one-party state, and that's just statements of fact. And for me, the important thing in the world is to understand how things operate, what really happens. I'm not interested in formulating an opinion based on what I think things should be or shouldn't be, because I think when you do that, you then tend to formulate ideas about different parts of the world as to how you think it should operate. And that's why the West can't understand and grasp that the Taliban is now wanting to have active discussions with the Chinese about how can you help rebuild the country. Now, the West looks at this going, why the hell's China wanting to work with the Taliban? Why does the Taliban want to work with the Chinese? Well, there are fundamental ideological differences in mindsets for very many reasons. But there's also the multipolar world's attitude is, yeah, we disagree on some things, but let's find things that we have common agreement, things that we can work together on. And we build a relationship on that basis. You can build a relationship with trust. And in the end, you might start to change certain attitudes. That's the whole perspective of the world going forward. But the West doesn't understand it. Because the West attitude is we should just go in and kill all the Taliban and that resolves the problem. Of course, it failed after 20 plus years. So that's also a very different mentality. So from the people who went in, there was a group of individuals who all knew each other and they worked in projects all around the world with governments and everything. They built a reputation where they were trustworthy, they were reliable, they delivered on things they promised they'd deliver on. And it's just, again, from the Chinese and the Russian perspective, everything's about trust. So if you build a relationship of trust, they'll go, okay, we've listened to what you've said. Did they agree with everything? No, but it wasn't a question of just a vision. Let's share a vision with a whole bunch of ideas because we think it's something you should consider and embrace. And they pretty much embraced nearly everything they suggested. And of course, they've changed it and it's morphed into something, far bigger than their perspective. I mean, the idea, resurrect the Belt and Road, what did that actually mean in reality? Was it something that would stretch across Eurasia? Well, the Belt and Road's extended into Africa, the Middle East, South America, etc., Southeast Asia. So it's grown and morphed quicker and in ways that no one could envisage at the time. But that's when an idea takes root. It's organic, it's fluid, and it will develop. Whether that's in a positive way or a negative way isn't the issue, but you just have a spark of an idea and then you run with it.
And would you say that the worse the situation gets for the West, for the collapse of the West and the, if you want to call it the Pax Americana, the more the people in charge or the people that make policy in the West, the more they get adversarial against China, Russia, and other countries. Because, like you said, back in 2001, the United States, Europe, everyone wanted to cooperate with China. They put China in the WTO. A few years ago, they let the yuan or renminbi be part of the SCR. And now all of a sudden, you have people like George Soros having a go at China, and people like Kyle Bass, for example, who I used to respect his views. He seems to be like a propaganda arm of I don't know who, but he just seems to criticize the CCP all the time. And like you, I don't have political leanings toward any side. I just want to analyze the world, and I want to be left alone, be taxed as little as possible, and do things. So could you do you agree with that? That the worse things get, the more they're going to try to put a spotlight on China and Russia and say how bad they are. Is that the way you see it too?
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of in my own podcast, I made the point that for me, there was, I mean, once the Trump administration took over, and the irony is Trump was supposed to have a very different relationship with the Chinese. And initially, you know, he had Xi Jinping over, rolled the red carpet out, and it looked like, hang on, maybe what was supposed to happen with China didn't. What it would have, sorry, and then subsequently we know they had this utterly futile trade war. But that was sort of 2017, 2018 was, ironically, it took the Americans that long to suddenly see China as a threat. Now, okay, people can argue from many perspectives as to, is China a threat the way the United States makes out? But the point is, from the US perspective, they went, oh, hang on, China's suddenly a threat. Prior to that, when China was rolling out all these initiatives all over the world, the Americans didn't see it. Part of that was because the US has this, we're the exceptional nation. No one can challenge our hegemony. China couldn't possibly do any of these things. China couldn't become a major global economic power. China couldn't have this sphere of influence over the globe. And so therefore they just dismissed it. But eventually it became impossible because the United States, they looked at jurisdictions all over the world and went, hang on, China's here. What's China doing here? Oh, they've got all this investment. They're building all this infrastructure. They're, developing economies. They're doing all this. Hang on, is there anywhere they're not doing it? Then they had the wake-up call and went, okay, we're going to have to now, how do we attack China? Let's have a trade war with them because we import all our goods and somehow we're going to win this trade war. In the US, no one wins a trade war, but the US lost the trade war significantly more than China did. And in fact, in many ways, it just accelerated in the Chinese mindset that, oh, hang on, what we were told, 2 decades ago, yes, that just reinforces that viewpoint. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And I made the point at the time. You're going to see anti-Chinese propaganda on a scale, and I said this early 2018 on my own podcast, like you've never seen. It'll make the anti-Russian propaganda seem like a relative drop in the ocean. And lo and behold, the last, 3.5 years, we've seen that. But of course, the problem the United States ran into is that the world doesn't buy this. It doesn't believe this. Yeah, I mean, it kind of bought a lot of the propaganda about Russia, but the problem is, like, Europe's a great example. China is enormously important to Europe as a trading partner. So it's sat there going, well, we're not sure we want to buy this, your propaganda or what you're telling us. And even if we do, we don't want to upset the Chinese too much because our relationship, we're very heavily dependent on them. Okay, you can argue China's dependent on Europe as well, but so there's a reciprocal relationship. You can't exactly expect Europe to have a Cold War with China. It's not like a Cold War with Soviet, the Union, where, excuse me, as we know, there was no real trade. There was no relationship between the Soviet Union and Europe in this regard, as one example. But yes, for sure, you're only going to see an acceleration of this. And I've made the point only recently again on Twitter where I find it astonishing and frankly a bit pathetic the way people in the West are trying to do everything to convince themselves and others that everything that happens in China means China's finished, China's economically destroyed, China is on a downward curve. The Belt and Road Initiative is run out of steam. Well, Belt and Road Initiative has 50 to 100 years more of growth. That's how big it eventually will be. The multipolar world is barely got out of nappies in many senses. It's kind of still evolving. There's a huge amount of growth because there's enormous poles in the world like Africa. Southeast Asia is obviously developing. And there's all this growth potential. And this is not going to happen in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years. It's a long gestation period. So it was suddenly the realization, hang on, we're now becoming weaker and weaker economically. Our status on the world stage is diminishing, which we can talk about that some other point. There's countless examples of how the United States is now, from an international perspective, like the emperor with no clothes. So the US has started to look at all this and go, hang on, China's a systemic threat, because from the US perspective, in very crude terms, administrations or whoever governs countries, their attitude is, you're either with us or you're against us. There's no in between. So you're either 100% in with everything we do and say whether you like it or not. If you're not, you're against us and you're an adversary. And the thing, of course, the problem the United States has is in trying to convince the rest of the world that China's a problem, it's severely damaged its own reputation. Because look at the United Kingdom as one example. It's supposed to be this so-called special relationship. And Britain will make some kind of nods about the whole Xinjiang story, which is a whole separate story in of itself. And in the meantime, they're just going, China, bring in the investment. Please throw money at everything. You can buy whatever companies you like. We will just turn, we're not bothered. Oh, by the way, what? So there's an American company wants to buy a UK company? That's a matter of national security. We need to go through a 6-month, 12-month process of assessing whether that really is a matter of national security. With regards to China, they don't care about it. So they say one thing, but their actions speak far differently. And that's the whole point, that the US is effectively, because of its policy towards China, it's isolated itself, not just in terms of its attitude. It tries to convince the ASEAN nations that China's, the devil incarnate, and they're going, well, actually, they're not. But even its own allies have looked at the US's policy towards China and started to go, hang on, this is absolutely unacceptable. We're not going to follow you. We're not going to cut off our nose to spite our face just because you have disagreements with China. And even though they won't publicly admit it, privately, European nations like Germany's looking at the US going with regards to China, going, well, we know why you have issues with China, and we know the reality and the truth. But again, there's a world of difference between what happens behind closed doors and out the purview of the media and what we see in terms of relationships between nations and what the public persona is, because the US is desperate to try and convince the world that you can still rally behind us, we're the future. Whereas privately, even our allies are going, well, we have some grave reservations now, and the world is changing, and we have to be extremely careful how we tread the balance between what's the old world and where the new world's going, and we don't want to be left behind, even though to a large extent the West is getting left behind because it's still trying to hang on to an old paradigm which is failing for all the reasons that are very familiar to people.
I would add as well about the trade war between the U.S. and China that I thought that was just for show, because the only reason the American economy, the manufacturing, has been gutted is because of Triffin's paradox, I would say. The U.S. dollar being the reserve currency, especially under a fiat currency system, is just pushed all the other countries in the world to try to undersell American companies. So
Yes.
I didn't think that was going to work at all. So I thought that was just for show.
Well, yes, it is, but because part of it was we have to show the world that we can take the Chinese on and defeat them. And they actually thought China would just capitulate very quickly. And that would be the end of the matter. But it'd be like, well, here's a bit of kudos for the United States. We've stuck it to the Chinese and they've capitulated. And of course, China was never going to do that. So the US kept digging to the point that they've dug a hole so deep now that when we talk, and I've talked about the political capital the West invests in all decision making, that it keeps investing so much political capital in a policy that even when the policy fails abysmally, they just keep digging. They go, well, we can't U-turn. We have to stick with this because if we U-turn, it's the end of our political careers. Okay, you can argue the political system's completely illusionary, and it is in the West, but the people who are at the head of the illusion, as far as we understand the illusion to be, the governments of Western nations, they're desperate because that's their livelihood, that's their future. If they lose their investment in that, from their perspective, I'm finished, I'm on the scrap heap. So they'll keep digging holes and they won't make changes. They won't admit there's mistakes. And I think Varoufakis was one guy who really shone a light on how the Western financial system operates. And he made the comment about the whole Greek the debt sovereign crisis, or sovereign debt crisis, where he said, he talked to the people in the IMF, the Lagardes, and said, look, this is a fundamental problem. And they went, yeah, we know it is, but we've invested all this political capital in how we do things that we can't change our policy decision. So we're just going to have to let things blow up. We're going to have to let these things happen because we can't be seen to do a U-turn or be the proverbial oil tanker that does a 360, a 180 or something, goes the opposite way. We just cannot do this. It's sort of what is ultimately one of the big failings of the West, and that's part of how the real system operates in the West. Aside from the perspective that there's all these powerful people moving chess pieces around, which isn't how the West operate. There is people within the whole system who are so wedded to a particular belief or a particular perspective, they can never change course, even if it means destroying everything. So the West is sat there. This is why we see Western central bank and the Fed makes policy decisions and it sits there and goes, well, we're just going to keep doing the same things because we can't do a U-turn. We can't admit everything's blown up and we have to have a complete policy change. They can't do that. So they just keep going along with the same strategy, the same philosophy, because they've dug a hole so deep for over a decade. You can't after a decade go, hello, we'd just like to tell everyone we made a complete mess of monetary policy, because they won't do that. So they just keep carrying on, digging more and more holes to the point now, it doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter whether they raise interest rates, don't raise interest rates, stop QE or continue QE. It doesn't make any difference. In the end, they're just going to blow everything up. And that's the point of stupidity, where at some point you would say, hang on, let's think the logical process through this. Where is this going to end up? Because I remember in 2009, I highlighted precisely where it would end up, because there's a logical process through it. They spent a whole, probably ironically, the pandemic, sort of a year ago or so, they had the wake-up call where, hang on, there's nothing we can do anymore. And that's a whole separate subject about how the pandemic, from a financial and economic perspective, was the worst nightmare realized for the Western financial system, the Western economies and the Western empire, effectively, because it transferred the problem that they thought they could contain in Wall Street and the banks and all the bubbles, asset bubbles. Then the problem became a fiscal problem. It leaked into Main Street. It became an inflationary problem. It became an economic problem they couldn't control. But they never foresaw that this was ever going to happen. And that's why I said they're just wedded to a belief system, and they just refuse to accept that there's any other possibility, that there's any other outcome. And they just are very tunnel visioned and myopic, and they just keep going in a certain direction, ignore everything that's going on the periphery, without realizing everything going on the periphery is going to completely upend them. This is why the West has made spectacular errors of judgment for decades. I mean, go back even to Vietnam War, spectacular error of judgment. I mean, the list goes on. It's just endless of policy failure decisions that have led us to where we are now from the Western perspective, where everything is just falling apart.
So I guess to conclude here, I would say that the problem, there's a couple of problems. One is that most people never learn about history and don't think also that history can repeat itself. We in the West seem to think that the world is just linear and that we're going to keep improving forever and ever, that we're better than our forefathers and that things can't happen again. Would you say that's what's going on? No knowledge of history and a belief that things can't happen again, or a belief that there are no cycles?
Yeah, I absolutely. I think well, you only have to look at, they didn't pick up on the warning signs in the dot-com era. They didn't, excuse me, pick up on the warning signs about what happens when you allow crass speculation in financial markets, massive leverage. They didn't ever conceive that what would happen to the derivatives markets, how that will become a major problem, and is really one of the biggest things the financial Twitter community never seems to address, is what's going on in the derivatives markets, particularly interest rate swaps. And also because, yes, they just perceive that we won't make the same mistakes, but they didn't learn along the way that 2008 was a wake-up call. What they did is they went, no, we just have to save everything. And okay, you can understand on one level why they did it, but that's because they perceived it would be just a momentary blip in history, that somehow we'll dig our way out of this. Of course, and you can't dig your way out of it because they didn't learn the lessons in history. That once you get into QE, zero interest rate policy, they didn't learn from what happened with Japan, but then they probably looked at Japan and went, well, that won't apply to us. So yeah, they haven't learned. But the other thing is, what they're now doing is they're not looking at the current situation and actually saying, even from I've made this point quite often on Twitter and even my own podcast, we're in an unprecedented point in history. I think this is the biggest, most fundamental change in 2,000 years, you could arguably say, because a lot of the idea we can try and look to the past and find a precedent for what's going to happen in the future, I don't think we can. Yes, we can look at certain situations and say, well, we could envisage, we saw inflationary pressure coming. But there isn't really the way to make the same comparisons as, okay, this happened in the 1970s, or this happened, in Weimar Germany, or this happened, during the war years, etc., because the financial system is so radically different to those points in history. For a start, we didn't have the derivatives markets we have now, which I think is one of the most poorly understood aspects of this entire problem. We didn't have the way all the banks effectively are so heavily interconnected now, how the global financial system, or certainly the Western financial system, how interdependent it is, all the risks, all the contagion problems, the systemic problems they've actually created since 2008, which was, for me, was astonishing. It's like going, we've got a problem, we're going to resolve the problem by actually creating more future systemic risk problems, because we're just effectively going to put out a lasso the whole system together, because that's our way of dealing with it, which of course was completely flawed. So yeah, there is a perspective that they don't see history repeating itself, or a version of history with a whole bunch of other parameters thrown in the modern era. But that's partly why, for me, all empires eventually fail. it's arrogance, it's ignorance, and also ultimately it's treating the very people who made your empire with disdain. And that's effectively what the West has done. It's completely abused its position. It is all the people who made the empire, rightly or wrongly, for what it is, which was the people. They've just, I mean, now we know really that since 2008, the whole point was we're saving everything to the detriment of everybody else. Even though, of course, ultimately the plan was never to destroy everything. They just thought, short-term problem, we'll control it. Eventually, everything will normalize and it won't affect the masses. But of course, that's not proved to be the truth. And those who think they're trying to destroy everything and control the masses, here's the problem with that. And this is a whole discussion point. But if you follow it through to the logical conclusion of where this all ends up, if you gut and destroy everything and you're doing it intentionally, you're going to end up where eventually you and I and everyone listening will be paying $50 for a loaf of bread. Now, when you get to that point, that's not going to work. You're going to have the masses starving. When you have a population starving, there's only one outcome. Put it this way, it's not going to be a very positive outcome for those in governance, whoever they may be. That's where this ultimately leads if you believe they're intentionally gutting and destroying them. They're not. It's their absolute stupidity, their arrogance, their ignorance, their moronic behavior, their myopic vision that has led us to the point where we are now, because they could have made different decisions. But they didn't make the decision because they just focused on preserving what they had without realizing as well that empires have to keep evolving, they have to keep changing, they have to keep embracing new ideas. They have to not just be dogmatically sticking to the idea this is how the world is going to be. Because here's the point, if China spent the next 10, 20 years not evolving their ideas and changing their perspective, China would vaporize extremely quickly. And that's not just in terms of international relations, but domestically they would have to evolve and change their ideas. And that's the whole basis. Empires collapse when they sit there and arrogantly go, we've got it all under control. We don't need to change or evolve. Our attitude's perfectly acceptable. It's acceptable to us, so it has to be acceptable to the rest of the world. But there's always pivot points where those attitudes change. And we're now at a very critical juncture in, as I say, 2,000 years of history where there is a big fundamental change. I've called it a paradigm shift because it's that fundamental. It's that big a change. And it transcends the financial system, it transcends economies. It actually gets fundamentally to the heart of who are we as people and how are we going to interact in future? Are we going to, just as a very simple example, are we going to go into Afghanistan and try and bomb the Taliban into submission? Or are we going to actually say, okay, we fundamentally disagree with you for 50 reasons. You do treat people, women like it's the Stone Age and all the other problems. Or are we going to sit there and go, yeah, that we have these fundamental problems, but we're going to actually address it differently. We're going to address it from a perspective where we'll sit down with you. Let's find points of common agreement. Let's see how, okay, if I do this for you, are you going to help us in this regard? And then start to build a relationship and also build it on the basis that you're going, I'm not expecting results today or tomorrow. Maybe this takes 5 years, maybe 12 months, maybe a decade. But it's a long-term perspective of how you have to change attitudes and how humanity has to fundamentally break the Western perspective that it's my way or the highway. It's you're either with us or against us. And if you're against us, well, it's a war, it's regime change, it's sanctions, it's all these things. And to cultivate that mind shift change is an enormous problem, particularly for the West, because people are conditioned and have been throughout their lives to believe ultimately that it is our way or the highway. But that is a fundamental shift in attitude that has to happen. And that, again, is an enormous discussion point. And I think what we've highlighted today in this first kind of chat we're having is this is why it's an enormous problem. This is why it's an enormous unfolding development and huge changes in the world. But what I would say is I'm pains to always make this point. there is a very simplistic view in Western eyes that, again, this is an empire. It's always going to be here. So there's people who understand the Western Empire is corrupt and far worse than corrupt, all the disgusting things that we all loathe and detest about it. But somehow it will always be here and it can never change. So whoever controls the Western Empire will always control everything. So therefore, the attitude is when the world starts to change or the West is in terminal decline, this is all part of a plan. It's all part of a process, because they're always in charge. So if China's in the ascendancy, it's because the power base is moved to China. Or if the West is imploding, they're deliberately doing all these things. That's also cultivating the mindset of people that this is an immovable object. It's always here. Well, it isn't, because we've seen throughout history, empires have been there and then they've disappeared. But the idea that there's always some common group of people behind an empire simply doesn't wash. And if we look at what's happening with Russia and China, it's absolutely obvious. The West loathes and detests the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians because they stand for everything the Western Empire, whatever that means. And that's an enormously interesting discussion point as well, is because we're vehemently opposed to them, is because they are presenting an alternative that the West has no control over, the West has no influence over. It is against everything the West stands for. That's because the Western Empire is disappearing, the unipolar world's ending, the old reality is collapsing, and there's a new reality, and the two worlds are playing out at the same time. Does that mean everything's perfect in the new reality? No, of course it is. There's mistakes, there's problems, but it's a better alternative to the old reality, and the world's beginning to embrace the new reality, and the West stand there going, hang on, the world's slipping away from us. The Western Empire is going, it's over. But it can't be over. How are we going to survive? How do we evolve? But Afghanistan's a great example of the decline and failure of the old reality. And the Chinese and the Taliban, and there's the Russians involved, the Iranians, Pakistanis, the Turkey, etc. This is an idea that we resolve things differently. Does that mean Turkey and Russia agree on everything? No. Does that mean Turkey and Iran do? No. Does China and Iran agree on everything? No. But there is a common goal to realize that if you want to make some fundamental changes, it's far better to work in a multipolar world with multilateral ways of thinking, not the idea there's a multilateralism that exists in the Western system, because it isn't. It's like the European Union is just it has nations within it that don't have increasingly less sovereign independence, etc., because that's the whole point. There isn't any globalization in the sense of what people perceive globalization to be now compared to what globalization will be in the future. Globalization in the multipolar world is all inclusive. It's everybody works together in cooperation. We have a globalization now, and everyone knows that doesn't exist in reality. It's not globalization. It's just a bunch of certain corporations, etc., trying to dictate policy, and from a Western perspective, and that's also failing. And these big corporations are now sat there going, how do we evolve, or are we going to die? And that again is an enormous discussion in of itself. So we're highlighting in very broad terms, here's a kind of roadmap, here's a very, very high level view, but we have to drill down into many, many different aspects of this. But as I would always say, the world is a very complicated place. It's not black and white, it's myriads of shades of grey. But there's one point someone said to me, probably about, I think it was 2011, and they said, if people understood that what actually has to happen to ensure that you go to bed in the evening and wake up in the morning and the world's pretty much in the same state as it was, if people understood what it takes to make that happen, they would then have a very, very different perspective as to how the world operates, how the world functions, and why the idea of overarching entities controlling things. Okay, there's periods in history where we know this, but the world isn't the same as it was a decade or 20 or 30 or 40 or even 50 years ago. It's massively changed. So The idea that these structures are still in place now that were in place 150, 200 years ago, they don't apply anymore. The world doesn't exist in that context. It's hugely changed. It's always constantly evolving. It's very complicated. So that's why I was trying to make the point. There isn't this simplistic version of how the world operates. And therefore, on the basis, we always think there's this overarching controlling system that exists in the West that controls everything. Therefore, we always apply people's perspective. On that basis, this means this, and this. But that's not actually how the world works in reality. And the Russians and the Americans have massive cooperation in back channels to make sure every single day that the world doesn't accidentally get blown up in a nuclear war. And most people go, hang on, but they're enemies, they're adversary. Well, yes, there are elements where they are adversary, but there are still core elements that mean there has to be cooperation on a certain level because there's an overarching need to have global security for a whole bunch of reasons. And it's not just on that basis. There's a whole bunch of other reasons why there is this form of cooperation. There isn't, there are spheres of influence in the world, no disputing it. And we can talk about those in the future. So we're not saying the things don't exist, but it's not this simplistic view that, historically there was families, so therefore the families about 200 years ago control the world today. It doesn't work that way. It's a constantly evolving, highly fluid world, and we have to be mindful that even things we perceive were in control 20, 30 years ago no longer applies. It's a very, very different roadmap. And as the world keeps evolving, we have to be mindful that it is changing, it is fluid, and not get bogged down in ideas that we've read happened in history. Because, you look at pre-World War I, how different the world was at that point compared to the end of World War I. I mean, the whole map of Europe changed. The whole dynasties that were in control of large parts of Europe never existed. So we could go back in history and go, well, they must still exist, but they disappeared. The Roman Empire disappeared. There's people who think that the Roman Empire, as it was, is still controlled by the same people today. Well, I have to say I profusely disagree with that assertion. That's just, again, trying to present this idea that there's always this order, there's always this overarching control in the world that applies. Well, if that were true, we wouldn't have the Western Empire trying to destroy China and Russia and also assassinate Putin and Xi, and that's an ongoing problem the Chinese and the Russians have to deal with. That's because here's an example where we know for a fact the world is changing hugely, and the idea that this is the first time in history this has happened, it just doesn't stack up in reality. Empires come and empires go. And when they disappear, the empire's gone forever. Look at, but people always argue, but it just shifted emphasis. Like the British Empire. Well, no, the British Empire still exists, it's just not called the British Empire, and it's the same people controlling it. Well, no, the British Empire's gone. It's finished, it's over. The Americans assumed the role of the empire post-World War II. And what was Bretton Woods all about? Hello. We've just barely finished World War II. By the way, the world reserve currency is the dollar, and no one sat there and went, hang on, what's actually happened here? Look at what happened in World War II. Look at who financed Hitler and bankrolled him into power. Why did all these events happen? There's all these things that show at certain points in history. There's the United States, and whoever you may perceive the United States to mean, assumed an ascendant position. And that was hugely to the detriment of a lot of British interests. But that's why Britain was bankrolled during World War II and effectively bankrupted, because when you get to the end of World War II, the world was bankrupt except for the United States. And that's a coincidence? No, of course it's not a coincidence. That's because there's vested interest in the US that weren't joined up with vested interests in the United Kingdom or other parts of Europe, etc.
Great, Paul. Just one more question before we conclude.
No, sure.
Yeah, where do you how long? I know it's difficult to predict timing wise. So do you think the decline of the West is going to be like still gradual, or do you see an acceleration? And are we near that collapse? And would that entail as well the collapse of the currencies, some kind of hyperinflationary event?
It's a great question. And I always get asked this, and I'm not copping out, but I have always made the point that the fundamental changes in the world are not time-driven, they're event-driven. So for me, there's always a point where I'm looking to see event-driven policies. So as much as we can focus on the decline of the West, and that's an important component of what we need to look at, I've always said, and I got asked probably 2013, what would I perceive to be important to look at in the future? And I made the point, you need to pay attention to what China, Russia, and Eurasia is doing. That's the biggest indication of where we are going, as opposed to where the West was declining. So there are the two worlds, and they're not separate worlds. There's some very distinct differences, and where there isn't interaction, but there is obviously a big grey area of interaction between the two. And the idea that one isn't dependent on the other, the decline of an empire is going to be accelerated by the ascendancy of another. And there's an argument that says, obviously, that there's some degree of the fact that as the other empire is declining, it's going to create ascendancy in China or Eurasia, because they have to be reactive. And that's why it's event-driven, not time-driven. What I would say is, from a time perspective, though, is the pandemic, and lots of people have lots of different perspectives on this, but for me, it was really the final nail in the coffin lid of the West, because I said earlier, it took the problem out of just Wall Street and the financial system and banks, etc., and it put the problem in Main Street. It put them in a situation where they never wanted it to be. And that's why even though we know they fudge inflation, and inflation's always been significantly higher, they kept going, oh, inflation's not a problem. And what they were telegraphing was, it's not a problem from our perspective because we can manage this. Okay, we'll fudge the real inflationary figures, but we can manage it. Trouble is now they can't manage it. They can't manage inflation that we're seeing all around the world and in domestic economies, because you can't fudge that anymore, because people are going, hang on, why is my gas and electric bill going up 20, 30% in the autumn? Look, you can't hide that, because it's a real macro sort of economic statistic that affects everybody. Whereas when it was contained in Wall Street, yeah, you can fudge it, and most people aren't paying attention. And you and I and everyone listening, well, who cares what they think, because the masses won't pay any attention to them anyway. So it's irrelevant. We can manage the process. But that process since March 2020 is massively accelerating. We also need to pay attention to what the Chinese and the Russians are doing in terms of de-dollarization, in terms of military cooperation from a Russian perspective, economic cooperation between Russia and every other nation on the planet, and China and every other nation, and between China and Russia. So there's all those indications that that timeline is massively accelerating. From the Western perspective, the decline is becoming more and more palpable. And therefore, okay, in terms of timelines, what would I perceive to be? I think a lot of people think the dollar's going to be here for another 10, 20 years. Well, there's no chance that, as the dollar currently exists as a notional, I call it notional world reserve currency, because from my perspective, it really isn't. It is and it isn't anymore, but it's in a huge decline. So the question is when? Well, I mean, I don't ever put timescales. What I do is I look at developments, and there are a number of developments that are happening in the West and also happening in the East, which I've discussed on my own podcast, which makes me see the next few weeks to be interesting. Does it mean everything collapses? No. Is there a possibility of something major happening? Yes. But it's a cyclical kind of thing where we all know we go through the sort of September time and then we go through the March time. But really, every single day now, there are 1,000 spinning plates, and if one of them stops spinning, everything will fall over. And increasingly, the West is trying to bail out the Titanic with a thimble. Well, you can work your proverbial arm off trying to do that, and eventually you won't be able to do it anymore. And that sort of process is speeding up as well. So would I say within less than 5 years? Yes. I think we're talking not years and years, but equally, I'm always looking at a whole bunch of data and things to say, okay, is there something we should be paying attention to that might indicate something happening imminently? And there are always some factors. I mean, I predicted what would happen in the repo markets back in 2019. I looked at stuff in 2018 and pointed out there's going to be serious structural problems through 2019. So there's always ways of looking. Can they mask the problem? Well, yes, to some degree they can do that. But it's always, people always go, they've stopped the problem. No, in fact, they're accelerating the problem in trying to fight their day with destiny, so to speak. But these are important developments. But equally, as I always say, China could come out tomorrow, for argument's sake, and it's not an unreasonable argument, go, we're going to back the yuan with gold. Well, what's the implication? It has enormous repercussions. And if anyone says they're not going to do that, well, what I can tell you is China was going to do it in 2016. And the United States at that point went, no, you're not. Because if you do, that's a declaration of hot war. So China went, okay, maybe we won't do it. So China went away and went, okay, we want to internationalize the yuan. So I know, let's put our foot down in terms of the digital yuan, and we can discuss that at another point. But what actually fundamentally has changed attitudes, and that's another huge discussion point, is Russia's military superiority compared to the United States. That's a big discussion point, which we'll park for today. But that's changed. So whereas China wouldn't have come out in 2016 after the US saying that, but actually they could come out now, and the United States is not going to have a hot war with the Chinese now. That's a big shift in attitude. So there are certain things we may see, certain things may happen that will be a momentous trigger. And at the end of the day, as much as China and Russia are mindful of not being seen to destabilize the world, and to give the US well, China created this problem, or Russia caused this collapse or something, they're always mindful that they're having to take mitigating action themselves. And China's an interesting discussion about what's going on there currently, which is another huge discussion point. But the point is, there will always come a point where they're going, well, hang on, we're seeing things happening in the West, so we're going to have to put our foot down on the accelerator, because we can't wait for something to blow up in a month or 2 months or whatever time. We therefore have to make an affirmative decision. And some of them are more benign affirmative decisions, but some of them could be more extreme. And okay, the gold-backed yuan's a very extreme reaction to a problem. But there can be lots of other things, which is why China is making all of benign moves from the Western perspective without actually realizing they are major, major moves, until suddenly the West goes, what, the digital yuan? What the heck is it? Oh, it's a vanity project. It's irrelevant. Oh, hang on. No, it's not a vanity project. Oh, we need a digital currency. Why do you want a digital currency? We don't know, but China's having one, so we have to have one. And believe it or not, that is exactly why they're doing what they do. They don't even understand why they need them. It's just a knee-jerk reaction to what China's doing, and China's doing it for a very obvious reason, because it wants to internationalize the yuan. And it's a great way of internationalizing it, because as well, and that's a big discussion, Pete, the FinTwit world is massively changing. Sorry, the fintech world's massively changing. And there are enormous changes that are happening that the West is not exactly thrilled about. And no, that doesn't mean Bitcoin becomes the world reserve currency in the future. But what it means is the financial world's evolving. So if China has international acceptance of the digital yuan, it changes the whole landscape of the entire global financial system in the blink of an eye. It's a revolutionary change. And therefore, I perceive that to be a massive indication of the acceleration that China's doing in piloting it, both domestically and internationally, that they're putting their foot on the accelerator because they perceive there are some major headwinds coming that they perceive means we have to start making more aggressive decisions, both in terms of the financial system. And that's why they're going through big aggressive changes domestically, because they want to try and remove leverage excess out the system. Because, yeah, China, it does have leverage and excess. But that's, again, we're back to another point, that's an enormous discussion. So you can see why, as we're just talking on a very, very high level, there are so many discussions, and then you have to drill down into significant detail as to what the implications of those are. So that's why I thought today, rather than just picking on a point going, what does this mean? Maybe we need to start at a very high level just to give an indication of the complexity of what's unfolding. So I'll never get drawn on a specific time, but I would say that the pandemic was a huge acceleration of the end and the demise of the West. It kind of brought the problem into an arena they didn't want to happen, or they perceived wouldn't happen, or, oh, maybe it's something that may happen in years to come, but it'll be a small problem we can contain. Now it's become a major problem. So it's accelerated the collapse. And maybe the next 6 months, 3 months, we have to constantly follow what the West's doing as much as what Eurasia is doing. But we always look, because I'm always looking, because at some point, rather like what happened in 2008, for me, there was some very obvious indicators in 2006 that 2008 was coming. And we didn't know exactly what would happen in 2008. So it's always looking for that. But the timescales as to if we see a major event happening, A, doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. But what it means is if we see these events, then we can comment on and say, look, this may be an enormous problem. And I think it's like, and that's another discussion point, what really is going on in the reverse repo markets? What is actually really driving this? And the idea it's all banks with huge amounts of liquidity and wanting to park it somewhere is not really what's going on. It's something far more fundamentally important, and is actually indicative of a major systemic problem in the Western financial system that they're trying to hide. And this is ongoing, and that's something we have to factor. Does it mean it blows up tomorrow or next week? No, but there comes a point where you can't keep your eye on 1,000 spinning plates. So at some point, you're going to take your eye off 10 of them. They're all going to collapse, and then the whole house of cards comes down. So if we keep seeing more and more of these plates not or slowing down, and they're trying to stop, the Titanic sinking with a thimble or a teaspoon, and we see lots of these, then we might be able to say, okay, we then envisage a problem that they simply can't manage anymore. But they are getting more desperate. They're getting more frantic. And the pandemic is, as I say, it's their worst nightmare realized, because it's everything they never believed would happen, now happening. And as much as anything, it's completely screwing up their perspective of how they manage the yield curve, and more importantly, how are they going to cope with the derivatives markets? Because the interest rate swaps market is enormous. It's extremely complex. It's being used in ways that most people would be very shocked to realize what they've actually utilized it for. But it's an enormous Achilles heel that is coming back to bite them extremely hard in the last 6 months. And the specter of inflation and adjusting interest rates has just accelerated the fear of not being able to manage a process, because they should never have had an interest rate swaps market that's $400 or $500 trillion in size. But because they did, to mask a whole bunch of other problems, this is now become an enormous problem, because inflation is now real. They can't hide it anymore. But anyway, that's another discussion. And we start on that, we'll be talking for hours on end. So it's probably a good point to stop there.
That was great, Paul. You really covered the bases there from 35,000 feet or 30,000 feet. And I look forward to speaking with you again in more details about like, more down to the ground.
No, it's a pleasure and really enjoyed it. And yes, I look forward to us doing, having further discussions in the future.
And to all the viewers out there, if you want to follow London Paul, you can go to his Twitter handle. It's the Sirius Report. Or if you want to look into his report and maybe subscribing, it's the SiriusReport.com.